Here to talk about today is not just the wonderful kimonos out there. I'm going to give you a little bit of brief history and background on the kimono as a traditional garment. One of the things that Kubota did was to essentially reinvent a traditional technique of decorating textiles, and he modernized this technique. It's called Tsujigahana, and here we have Kubota himself and an example of the modernization of this very traditional technique, Tsujigahana. And this textile form was really lost to everybody after it had been around for about 100 years. It was created first in the late 15th century. It went through the 16th century, and then all of a sudden, the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, completely disappeared. But Kubota was so taken with it that he really said it had to be reinvented, and then he began to use it in his own designs. Now, the kind of kimono he designed were really very high-end. They were high fashion, they were labor-intensive, and this is the kind of traditional kimono dyeing that he worked with initially. The Yuzen dyeing is it's a paste resist technique that you draw the design with a tube of paste, and that then when you give it its first dyeing, the paste will keep the dye from going through the textile. So you will have white lines, white areas that you can then color in. And in something like this, you can see there's a lot of resisted areas that don't have the white. They can be touched up with paint to give color. They can have other kinds of painting done on them, but it's all very, very labor intensive, and that means it's expensive. But Kubota was a genius at doing this for someone so young, and so many people started to come to him to get their special kimono, the kind of things that you might order 6-8 months ahead of time to be sure you got it. And let me just note too that for these kind of events, as I say, they weren't the everyday events, but for weddings, for special ceremonies, coming of age was one important one. Every girl would want a special kimono when she turned 21. For things like rituals, kind of like christenings, you would want a special kimono, and you'd also want a special kimono for your child, too. And even sometimes for funerals, a special kimono would be worn. So these were unique items, and you were willing to spend the money for them because you want it to look special, you want it to look unusual, and you want it to stand out in a crowd. So these are the kinds of things that Kubota would design. Now, he was only a young man then. He was 19, 20 when he started to have a real reputation. But at the age of 20, he suddenly discovered something that really changed his life. And this was the Tsujigahana, the technique I mentioned earlier, this ancient technique that was used to decorate textiles. It too was a resist kind of dyeing technique, but it used tying rather than paste. So it was much more intense, again, very labor intensive. And once the dyeing had been done, the Tsujigahana textiles would be touched up with ink drawings, sometimes with gold leaf, sometimes with embroidery. And the examples that I'm showing you here, there aren't a lot of full kimono done with Tsujigahana that are still in existence. And what you see on here is a screen where you have pieces of two kimono that the cloth was taken and mounted on a screen because they were so rare, they wanted to be preserved. And you have a wonderful example of Tsujigahana here and a detail over there where you can see that the white areas were stitched around, pulled tight, and then protected during the dye. And when the dyeing was done, then they were taken and flattened out, and you would have ink drawing done on them to make the whole thing a little bit more elegant. So Kubota saw a design like this, a piece of textile, only a fragment of textile in a museum, and became entranced with it. It really captivated his imagination, and at 20 years old, he said, "This will be my life's work. This is something I want to learn how to recreate." Now, keep in mind, this technique disappeared at the end of the 17th century, so around 1699 or thereabouts, and nobody in the modern day textile trade knew how to do any of these techniques. You did know tie resist, but they could not really duplicate the kind of work that was done on these textiles. So Kubota had a really lot of work laid out for him. One of the things he realized very soon, though, in his research and his experimentation, was that he was not going to be able to reproduce Tsujigahana exactly as it had been in the early years. The types of fabric we had today in his day were different. The types of dye used were different. So what he decided ultimately was that it would be necessary to recreate it in a style that fit the modern world. And this is where he really put his skills as a yuzen dyer to good effect, because he used yuzen dyeing, a combination of yuzen dyeing, tie dyeing, which the form he used is known as shibori in Japan, and it's a very intense, tightly tied kind of dyeing technique where you have to make hundreds, if not thousands, of little ties to get the right effect. He also had studied Western art as well as Japanese art, and so he took all of these things, the combination of modern dyes, his experience in yuzen, his understanding of Japanese and Western art, of new types of fabric that could be used, and just put this all together to create his version of Tsujigahana, which he called Itchiku Tsujigahana, because he wanted a reference to this textile that had so inspired him, something similar to the one on my left, and then what he came up with on his own, a piece of Itchiku Tsujigahana, where you can really see that he's used the elements, but that it goes beyond what the original one was. He did several decades of research, and he was a perfectionist too, and it wasn't until the 1970s, the early to mid-1970s, that he felt he had enough control of the Tsujigahana to really start exhibiting it. And this is one of his early pieces. It's from 1980, and in a minute I'll show you another early piece that's a little bit earlier than this. But this gives you an idea of where he was coming from. It's a very traditional design in some ways. The weeping cherry tree, that's a constant motif in Japanese art and in Japanese textiles. And so looking at this, at first you might think, well, it's a traditional type kimono, but then you look at the kind of dyeing techniques he used, the ink work that's on it, and it becomes a very different thing. But this was one of the first pieces he showed in the 1980s. And let me just go on to the next one, which was in his first exhibition in the 1977 exhibition. I think that was at Mikimoto in Tokyo, if I remember correctly. So this was one of his very early pieces, too. And a kimono that looks like a regular kimono in some ways, but the design is just very, very different. In the earlier pieces, he does tend to look more traditional. He tends to use traditional kinds of elements, this cloud-like form you see in a lot of older kimono, this lozenge, this sort of almost zigzag form, that appears in many, many traditional designs. But then when you start looking at the detail and the kind of dyeing, that's where the differences really come up. And in these early kimono, he did stick mostly to dyeing. He was careful with the kind of ink drawing he'd do. he did, but it did start to change over time. And when we see the later kimono, you will see that they are very, very intensely drawn as well as intensely dyed. Okay, and as Itchiku showed some of his work in the late 70s, in the early 1980s, he really began to transform the idea of surface design for kimonos, just very different kinds of patterns that he used, like these oversized hollyhock leaves was really one of the elements. The designs got bigger, they got more intense in color, and in some ways this may remind you of the 1930s pieces I showed earlier, but if you look at the texture of them, the texture is truly unique, and it's one of the things that gained him really international attention because this was such a different look for kimono. Women were falling away from the kimono, and he wanted to get them excited about wearing it in different ways. These are two shots from a fashion show he did around 1984 when he tried a different way to get women to wear kimono. He has a kimono that's worn very tightly tied. The obi is worn as men would wear their obi, not as women would wear, which is up here. And so that's down around the hips. It's pulled almost like a sari, but the rest of it, this tightly draped underneath element, and high heels, jewelry. These were all things you would never wear with kimono traditionally, but Kubota was trying to excite people to do something different. He also designed kimono that were used in no plays. Now, no is a traditional Japanese theatrical form of art. It's very, how can I say it? It's more than traditional. It's very hard to make changes in no, but one of the things that None is known for is fantastic costuming, very elegant, heavy costumes that are very colorful. And he was interested in the theater himself. At one point in his youth, he had worked as a theater designer. And so he created these costumes that could be used in no plays. And this is an example, one of the actors in a no play wearing one of his kimono, and this was the kimono that you saw in the opening slide of Mount Fuji and how it would be worn in the play. And then you can imagine when that actor turned his back to the stage, to the audience, you would have this wonderful, wonderful vision of Mount Fuji there. So this was another element that was part of his development of his technique of design with kimono. Now, kimono are usually treated as individual entities, as a single garment and the design done for a single garment. But in the early 1980s, Kubota started to look in other directions. He started to look at the kimono more as a real canvas for art. And at that time, he began to think in terms of series rather than the individual kimono, but not just a series where you make many views of one thing, but a continuous series where your kimono becomes the canvas for something much larger. And for this, he created in his own mind something that he saw as his life's work, where he could create a panoramic vision that would go on and on, that as you looked at it, it would be like unrolling a Chinese scroll, a landscape scroll, where you unroll it and you gradually expose the landscape. And his idea was that you would take these kimono, each one would bear a unique image, but meant to be shown as part of a group. This series is called The Symphony of Light. It was Kubota's planned life work. He initially intended to do 80 kimono that would show the 4 seasons as well as the universe. Certainly ambitious on his part. And this is just a small part of it. 3 of the initially planned 80 kimono. And you will see part of the Symphony of Light in this exhibition. Unfortunately, he died before he could complete the whole 80 kimono that he had in mind, but we have 36 that he did complete, and he completed 2 of the seasons, autumn and winter, and a small portion of the universe. And this, as you can see, is autumn, a detail from the autumn segment, and another detail from the winter segment. Kubota, like many Japanese, was fascinated with nature. He loved nature. It was one of the most important motifs that you see in his kimono. And he wanted to express the magnificence of nature in this idea, this series, that would just be continuous. Look at space, time, light, through a season or several seasons. So they were quite extraordinary, and I think when you go out there and look at them, you will really see how extraordinary this concept was. He had a really intense commitment to this kind of work, and he's left us a wonderful, wonderful art legacy in his design elements.